The harsh winter winds howled through the forests of the Midwest. But amidst the snowstorms and freezing temperatures, a German Shepherd mother was fighting for the life of her pup. Max, her sickly pup, was growing weaker by the hour, and Freya, his mother, knew time was running out. She had no choice but to seek help from a man living on the edge of the forest, a man who might hold the only hope for saving her son. But what happened next would shock everyone, changing their lives forever. Prepare yourself for a story of resilience, love, and an unimaginable bond between a mother and her pup. The wind howled through the barren trees, a biting cold that pierced the skin and made the world feel eerily desolate. Snowflakes fell in thick, swirling gusts, blurring the already invisible path. The once lush forest had been swallowed by the harsh grip of winter, leaving only a blanket of snow and ice beneath a pale gray sky. Freya, the German Shepherd mother, was pushing forward with a determination that came from a place of pure love and desperation. Her fur, thick with layers of snow, clung to her trembling body. But it wasn't the cold that made her shiver. It was the sight of her pup, Max, struggling to keep up. Max's tiny body was almost unrecognizable, his once shiny coat now matted with frost, his ribs showing through the thin layer of fur. His breathing was shallow and labored, every step a battle. The young pup had been ill for days, his body weakening under the weight of the harsh conditions. Freya had done everything she could to keep him warm, but she knew it wasn't enough. They needed help, and there was only one person she could turn to. The man. The one she had heard about from other animals in the forest. The one who lived on the edge of the woods, away from the chaos of the town. Freya had never met him, but rumors spoke of his kindness, of his willingness to help those in need. She had no other option. She had to get Max there, no matter the cost. As Freya trotted through the snow, she couldn't help but glance down at her pup. Max was struggling. His tiny legs were barely holding him up, and his body swayed with every step. Freya stopped briefly, nudging him gently with her nose, trying to encourage him to keep going. But Max let out a soft whimper and collapsed into the snow, his tiny frame too weak to move. Her heart sank as she saw the desperation in his eyes. This wasn't just exhaustion. It was something worse. She could feel it in her bones. Time was running out. Freya let out a quiet whine, trying to comfort her pup. But deep down, she knew that if they didn't reach the man soon, Max might not survive. With her tail tucked low and her body tense, she forced herself to move forward, lifting Max in her mouth and carrying him for as long as her body would allow. The storm continued to rage, the wind biting at Freya's face and the snowdrifts growing deeper with every step. But she refused to stop. Max's life depended on it. Hours passed as the temperature dropped even further. Freya's paws were raw from the cold, and her body was trembling with fatigue. But just when she thought she couldn't go any further, she spotted a faint light in the distance. A small cabin, hidden by the snow, but unmistakable in its warmth. It was her destination, the man's house. Max let out a weak whimper from her mouth, his tiny body shaking in the cold. Freya pushed forward, her steps growing more deliberate, more desperate. As she reached the front door of the cabin, Freya's legs gave out beneath her. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she placed Max gently on the porch. She sat down beside him, her eyes fixed on the door, her whole body trembling. She whined softly, the sound weak but filled with hope. The door creaked open, and a man stepped out, his face a mixture of surprise and concern. When his eyes landed on the frail puppy, his expression shifted to one of immediate compassion. Without hesitation, he bent down and scooped Max up in his arms, rushing inside. Freya could barely hold herself upright, but she knew, deep in her heart, that Max was finally safe. Inside the small cabin, the warmth was a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. The fire crackled in the hearth, its glow casting soft shadows across the rustic walls. The man, whose name was Jack, hurriedly placed Max onto a warm blanket by the fire. His hands shook slightly as he checked the pup for signs of life, his eyes scanning for any signs of injury or further distress. Max's body was cold to the touch, his fur damp with snow and sweat. He shivered violently, his small body struggling to generate any warmth. Freya, too exhausted to move, stood silently in the doorway, her eyes fixed on the man and her pup. She felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, the exhaustion threatening to overtake her. But she couldn't leave. Not now. She had brought Max this far, and she couldn't give up now. She needed to see him safe, to know that he would survive. Jack turned to her, his gaze softening as he saw the weariness in Freya's eyes. "You did everything you could, girl," he said gently. "But now it's my turn." His voice was filled with sincerity, a deep, almost primal compassion for the animals who sought refuge in his cabin. He had always lived alone with only his animals for company, but something about this situation, this desperate, frozen mother and her fragile pup, struck him to his core. He went to the kitchen and pulled out a warm, homemade broth. Bringing it over to Max, he held the bowl to the pup's lips, coaxing him to drink. At first, Max seemed too weak to respond, his eyes unfocused, his body too tired to react. But Jack persisted, gently nudging the bowl against Max's nose until the pup finally, weakly, lapped at the broth. Jack's heart swelled with a sense of relief as Max's body slowly began to warm. Freya stepped into the cabin, her eyes never leaving Max. She watched as the man carefully tended to her pup, offering him warmth and comfort. It was a feeling she had never experienced before. Complete trust. She had spent her entire life in the wild, protecting her own and surviving alone. But here in this small cabin, she felt something different, a sense of security, a sense of hope. Jack looked up at Freya and gave her a reassuring smile. "He's a fighter, just like you. He'll be okay." His words were simple, but they carried weight. They filled the room with a quiet sense of optimism that seemed impossible given the circumstances. Freya, who had been so afraid for so long, felt a flicker of relief in her chest. She had done her part. Now, it was up to this man to help them both survive. As the hours passed, Jack worked tirelessly to warm both Freya and Max. He set up a small bed by the fire for Freya, coaxing her to rest as he tended to her pup. But Freya remained close by, her instincts too strong to allow her to sleep. She watched as Jack continued his work, his focus unwavering. The night wore on, and Jack could see the signs of improvement in both mother and pup. Max's breathing became less labored, his eyes clearer. Freya, too, seemed to relax, her body no longer trembling with the cold. It was a small victory, but it was enough to keep hope alive. Just before dawn, Jack went outside to gather more firewood, knowing the long cold days ahead would require constant warmth. As he stepped out into the snow, he paused and looked out over the forest, the silence of the morning settling over him. He had lived alone for so long, but in that moment he felt a deep connection to the animals he had helped over the years. And now, with Freya and Max in his care, he knew he had been given the opportunity to make a real difference in their lives. When he returned to the cabin, he was greeted by the soft sounds of Freya and Max resting peacefully by the fire. The storm had stopped, and the sun was beginning to rise, casting a golden light through the cabin windows. It was a new day, and for the first time in a long while, Jack felt a sense of peace. The days that followed were a test of patience, perseverance, and hope. Jack, now fully committed to helping Freya and Max, found himself doing everything he could to keep them warm and fed. The weather outside had not improved, and the snow continued to blanket the world around them. The storm, which had been relentless since their arrival, had left the ground frozen and the air biting. But inside the cabin, Jack worked tirelessly to ensure that Freya and Max had everything they needed to recover. Max was no longer the frail, lifeless pup he had been when Freya first brought him into the cabin. His breathing had steadied, and his body temperature had returned to normal. But the road to recovery was not without setbacks. He still had moments of weakness, his tiny body struggling to keep up with the demands of healing. Freya, too, was still recovering from the harsh conditions of the wilderness, but she was determined to stay by her son's side. Jack had never been one to ask for help, but in this situation, he found himself reaching out. He made regular trips to the nearby town to gather supplies, making sure that they had enough food, medicine, and anything else they might need to weather the storm. Each time he returned, he brought back something new. A fresh batch of firewood, a few cans of soup, or a blanket to keep them warm. He even brought back a few toys for Max, who seemed to appreciate the small acts of kindness. But as the days wore on, Jack began to notice something troubling. Freya had started to show signs of stress. Her once pristine coat was beginning to look disheveled again, and she was growing thinner by the day. The weight of her responsibility of caring for Max and surviving in the harsh wilderness was beginning to take a toll on her. Jack noticed the small things first. The way she no longer greeted him at the door when he came home. The way her eyes seemed distant when she looked at him. One night, as Jack sat beside the fire, trying to warm his own tired bones, Freya walked over and gently nudged his hand with her nose. Her eyes, usually filled with determination and strength, were now filled with something else. Something that Jack couldn't quite place. He knew something was wrong, and it was breaking his heart to watch her struggle. "Hey girl," Jack said softly, reaching out to stroke her fur. "Are you okay?" He could feel the tremble in her body, the exhaustion that had taken over, but there was something more in her eyes. She was scared. Scared for her pup. Scared for herself. Freya lowered her head, letting out a soft, almost imperceptible whine. Jack's heart ached as he realized what she was asking him. She needed his help, just as much as Max did. She needed reassurance, just as much as her pup had needed his care when she first brought him in. Jack made a decision that night. He would do whatever it took to help Freya and Max, no matter the cost. It was no longer just about survival. It was about giving them both a chance at a new life, a chance to heal, and a chance to live the way they deserved to. He was in this with them, through thick and thin. The next day, Jack made a plan to take Freya and Max to the town's vet. He had heard rumors of a local veterinarian who was known for his skills in caring for injured or sick animals, and he was determined to get the help they needed. It would be a long journey, but Jack was willing to do anything to ensure that Freya and Max would have the chance to recover fully. As Jack prepared to leave, Freya and Max stood by the door, their eyes following his every move. They trusted him now, fully, and Jack could see the gratitude in their eyes. He couldn't bear the thought of losing either of them, but he knew this journey was necessary for their survival. The weather, as always, was unpredictable, and the winds were howling outside. The snowstorm had not relented, and the world outside seemed more dangerous than ever. But Jack was resolute. With a determined look in his eyes, he opened the door to the cabin and stepped out into the cold, Freya and Max following close behind. As they trudged through the deep snow, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The storm was harsh, the world around them unforgiving, but in this moment, they were together. They were a family, and they would fight through the storm together. The journey to the town was grueling, made all the more difficult by the persistent snowstorm. Jack was familiar with the path, the small, winding road that led to the town, but the weather made it nearly impossible to navigate. The wind howled, the snow whipped in every direction, and the cold seemed to seep into his very bones. Every step felt like a battle, but Jack wasn't alone. Freya and Max trudged beside him, their determination mirroring his own. Max, though still weak, had begun to show signs of life. He trotted next to his mother, his little legs struggling but pushing forward, as if he understood the importance of this journey. Freya, too, was pushing herself, the burden of responsibility weighing heavily on her, but her love for her pup drove her forward. They were a family now, bound together by their shared struggle and resilience. As they approached the town, Jack's heart began to race. The small veterinary clinic was tucked away at the edge of town, a little stone building that looked almost as weathered as the rest of the town. Jack had been here before when his own dog had fallen ill many years ago, but it had been a long time. He could only hope that this time, the vet would be able to work the same kind of magic. When they arrived, the clinic's lights were dim, and Jack hesitated before knocking on the door. He wasn't sure what to expect, or if the vet would even be able to help, given the state of Freya and Max. But after a long moment, the door creaked open, and an older man stepped out. His face was lined with age, his eyes kind but wary. He looked at Jack, then down at Freya and Max, and his expression softened. "I see you've got a couple of strays there," he said, his voice warm but with an edge of concern. "Come on in, we'll see what we can do." Inside the clinic, the warmth of the room was a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, and there was a comforting quiet that settled over the room. Jack gently guided Freya and Max inside. the door closing behind them with a soft thud. The vet, whose name was Dr. Walker, immediately began to examine Max, moving with a practiced ease as he checked the pup's tiny body for any signs of injury or illness. Dr. Walker frowned as he examined the small dog's frail body. "He's malnourished, dehydrated," he said, his tone serious. "But I think we can help him. It's going to take time though. Lots of care and patience." Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him. At least there was hope. He watched as Dr. Walker carefully injected Max with fluids, the pup letting out a small whine as the needle pricked his skin. Freya stayed close, her eyes never leaving her son. Jack could see the concern in her eyes, but there was something else there too, a glimmer of hope. She trusted this man, just as she had trusted Jack. When Dr. Walker was done, he turned his attention to Freya. He ran his hands over her body, checking for signs of injury or infection. "She's in better shape than the pup," he said, his voice softer now. "But she's exhausted. It'll take some time for her to recover fully, but I think she'll be okay." Jack breathed a sigh of relief. He knew that Freya had been struggling, but hearing that she was going to make it was the best news he had heard in weeks. Dr. Walker offered some advice on how to care for both Freya and Max in the coming days. He gave Jack a bag of medications, some special food to help them regain their strength, and instructions on how to monitor their progress. Jack nodded, grateful for the guidance, and promised to follow his instructions to the letter. As they left the clinic and stepped back out into the cold, Jack felt a sense of calm that he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about healing, about giving Freya and Max the chance they deserved. And with the vet's help, he knew they could make it through the storm. The walk back to the cabin was just as difficult as the journey to town, but this time there was a lightness in Jack's step. Freya and Max, though still weak, were making progress. They were no longer just surviving, they were healing. And that was a victory in itself. By the time they returned to the cabin, the storm had begun to ease. The snow was still thick on the ground, but the wind had calmed. Inside, Jack made a fire, the warmth spreading through the room as Freya and Max curled up by his side. He sat with them, his hand resting gently on their fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of their breathing. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to believe that they were going to be okay. The days following their visit to the vet passed slowly. The storm had cleared, but the harsh winter still gripped the land. Jack spent his days tending to Freya and Max, following Dr. Walker's advice to the letter. He was up before sunrise, preparing warm meals for them both, and checking on their condition throughout the day. Freya, though still weak, was slowly regaining her strength, her coat beginning to regain its luster. Max, however, remained fragile, his body thin and still struggling to put on weight. Every day, Jack watched as the bond between him and the two dogs deepened. Freya's trust in him was unwavering, and Max, though hesitant at first, had started to show signs of affection. When Jack would kneel beside them, he could feel Max's tiny tail wagging ever so slightly, as if the pup was beginning to understand that he was safe now. But there was still a sense of urgency in Jack's heart. He knew that time was running out. Every moment they spent in the cold, isolated cabin was a risk. He couldn't let the storm steal away this second chance. He needed to get them both back to full health, and fast. One morning, after he had finished feeding them, Jack noticed something unusual. Max had finally begun to walk on his own, though his steps were unsteady. His little legs trembled, but he managed to stand and take a few cautious steps toward Jack. It was a small victory, but to Jack, it meant everything. He watched the pup for a moment before turning to Freya. She was still lying down by the fire, her eyes half closed, but there was something different in her gaze. She looked at Max, then at Jack, her eyes softening with gratitude. The bond between them was clear. Freya had come to see Jack not just as the man who saved her, but as part of her family. Jack smiled, a warm, genuine smile that he hadn't allowed himself to wear in months. He knew they were still a long way from being out of danger, but seeing Max move, seeing Freya look at him with that trusting gaze, it was a sign. They were making progress, and maybe, just maybe, they would be okay. Later that afternoon, Jack decided to take the next step. He bundled up in layers of clothing to face the frigid cold outside, but this time, he didn't go alone. Freya and Max, though still weak, were going to be by his side. It was time to see if they could make it back to town. If the road was too difficult, he would turn back. But he had to know. They had come this far. They deserved to know that they could make it through the storm together. The walk was slow, with Jack supporting Max as the pup staggered beside him, leaning against his leg. Freya, though stronger, still moved with a deliberate caution, constantly checking on Max. Jack could see the care in her eyes. The same care that had driven her to bring her son to him all those days ago. They had come to trust him. And now, they were all taking a risk together. The snow crunched beneath their feet as they made their way down the narrow road. The wind had picked up again, swirling around them in angry gusts. But Jack pressed on, determined. They couldn't stop now. They had fought so hard to get this far. After what felt like hours, they reached the small bridge that crossed the creek that separated their cabin from the town. The road ahead was covered in thick snow, but Jack didn't hesitate. He gently urged Max forward, his hand resting on the pup's fragile back as they crossed the bridge together. It was when they reached the other side that something unexpected happened. Max, who had been struggling to keep up, suddenly stopped in his tracks. Jack turned to look at him, concern flooding his chest. Had something gone wrong? Was he too weak to continue? But then, to Jack's surprise, Max lifted his head, his nose twitching in the air. He let out a soft bark, his voice still weak but unmistakable. Jack froze, his heart racing. In the distance, just past the tree line, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. A figure was walking toward them through the snow. It was a man, tall and broad, his face obscured by a thick scarf and hat. But his presence was undeniable. Jack's heart skipped a beat as the man grew closer, his form becoming clearer in the falling snow. Could it be? Jack? The man's voice rang out through the stillness, and Jack's pulse quickened. He recognized that voice. After all these years, he knew who it was. It was Tom, his old friend, the man who had disappeared years ago, leaving Jack and everyone else behind. Max barked again, more eagerly this time, as if he recognized the man too. Freya too seemed to perk up, her ears twitching at the sound of the familiar voice. Jack's mind raced as he stood frozen in place, torn between disbelief and joy. After all these years, Tom was back, and the timing couldn't have been more surreal. In that moment, everything seemed to come full circle. Tom's appearance seemed almost surreal. Jack couldn't believe his eyes. It had been years since he had seen his old friend. And in that moment, everything seemed to blur. The cold, the snow, the pain of the past. There was only the present standing in front of him, with Max and Freya by his side. "Jack, is it really you?" Tom asked, taking slow steps toward him. His voice was thick with emotion, a deep, gravelly tone that carried a weight of years lost. He was different now, older, more weathered, but there was no mistaking the bond they once shared. Jack didn't know what to say. His mind was still processing everything. How was it possible? How had Tom found them? His eyes shifted between Tom, who was now within arm's reach, and the two dogs at his side. He had so many questions, so many things he wanted to ask. I can't believe it's you," Jack managed, his voice shaky. His heart raced with a mixture of confusion, anger, and relief. The sudden appearance of Tom after all these years felt like an emotional tidal wave crashing over him. Tom looked at Freya and Max, and his gaze softened. I saw them in the distance, and I couldn't believe it." His voice trembled as he reached out to gently stroke Freya's coat. "I was worried about you, Jack. I had to come back." Jack's eyes narrowed slightly. The confusion was overwhelming. "Why did you leave, Tom? Why did you disappear like that? We needed you, especially after everything that happened." Tom's face fell. He glanced down at the snow beneath his feet, guilt washing over him. I was lost, Jack. I thought I was protecting you by walking away, but I only ended up hurting everyone I cared about." He looked up, his eyes meeting Jack's. "I'm so sorry, but I'm here now, and I'm not leaving again. Not when I know what matters." Jack looked at him, his heart torn. So many years had passed. So much pain had accumulated in the silence between them. He wanted to scream at Tom, to ask him why he left without a word, without any explanation. But as he looked at the dogs, Max, weak but alive, and Freya, strong but cautious, he knew that something in him had shifted. This wasn't just about the past, this was about the future. And for the first time in a long time, Jack could feel a sense of hope creeping in. He had always been alone, keeping his emotions locked away to protect himself from further hurt. But now, with Freya, Max, and Tom all standing before him, he realized that it wasn't too late to rebuild what had been broken. Freya, sensing the shift, walked slowly over to Tom, her tail wagging cautiously. She sniffed him, her sharp eyes never leaving his face. Jack held his breath, watching the interaction. Could Freya trust him again? Could Max? To Jack's relief, Freya gently nudged Tom's hand with her nose, offering him a tentative gesture of acceptance. Tom knelt slowly, his hands shaking as he stroked her fur. For a brief moment, everything seemed to pause, the cold winds, the uncertainty, the regrets. It all seemed to melt away in the presence of these two dogs. And the man who had returned when least expected, Max, ever the curious pup, stepped forward too, his tiny legs wobbling with every move. He looked at Tom, then at Jack, and then back at Tom. There was a brief moment of hesitation, but Max finally gave a soft bark, almost as if to say, "I trust you." The moment was simple, but it was a moment that spoke volumes. Jack looked at Tom, his chest tight with emotion. He wanted to say so much, to tell him how much his disappearance had hurt, how much he had longed for this moment, but instead he just nodded. His eyes were filled with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. He didn't need to speak the words because, in that moment, they both understood the unspoken truth. "I'm glad you're here," Jack finally said, his voice steady despite the flood of emotions running through him. Tom smiled softly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm glad to be here, Jack. I promise I won't let you down again." For a moment, the wind howled louder, and snowflakes swirled around them. But within their circle, there was a warmth that had been absent for so long. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel so frightening. Together, they could face whatever came next. Freya, Max, Jack, and Tom. They were all part of the same story now. A story that was still unfolding. And just like that, the storm outside didn't seem so fierce anymore. The following days passed in a blur. The snowstorms that had raged outside now seemed like distant memories, their ferocity softened by the warmth of a house filled with hope. Jack, Tom, Max, and Freya had settled into a new rhythm, one where the weight of the past slowly began to lift. But even as the days grew warmer, the scars of the past remained. Healing wasn't easy. It never is. Freya, once a guard dog with a hardened exterior, had become a gentle companion to both men. She lay at Jack's feet, ever watchful and patient, as if understanding that the journey ahead would be long. Max, despite his small size, seemed to possess an energy that could light up the room. His playful antics brought laughter into a home that had been silent for too long. But it was Tom who seemed most changed. He spent his mornings tending to the animals, quietly reflecting on his own thoughts. There were still nights when Jack would find him staring out the window, his gaze lost in the distance, as though searching for something that he could never find. "You all right?" Jack would often ask, sitting down beside him. Tom would nod, though the lines of regret were etched deeply on his face. "I don't think I'll ever be all right, Jack. I've been running from my mistakes for so long that I don't know how to face them."